In just 38 seconds, 40 years of environmental conviction would be revealed as negotiable. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. didn't expect the text messages. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse didn't expect such complete capitulation to be documented in writing. Cameras captured the moment when principle met ambition and lost. The Senate chamber watched as environmental legacy crumbled for political opportunity. What did the Rhode Island senator reveal about Kennedy's private communications with Trump advisors that made his former allies call him the greatest betrayal in environmental movement history? March 11, 2025, 10:23 in the morning. The Senate Environment and Public Works Committee hearing room carried unusual tension for what was technically a Health and Human Services confirmation hearing. But Chairman Tom Carper had invoked joint jurisdiction, arguing that environmental health fell squarely within his committee's oversight. What no one said explicitly but everyone understood was that Kennedy's environmental record was about to be weaponized against him by the very movement he had once led. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. entered with his characteristic confidence, but his usual environmental champion persona felt oddly absent. At 71, Kennedy had spent more years fighting polluters than most senators had been in politics. His legal victories against corporations dumping mercury into rivers, against coal plants poisoning communities, against regulatory capture of the EPA had made him a legend among environmental activists. That legacy was about to become his greatest liability. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse sat reviewing documents with the focused intensity of someone who had prosecuted environmental crimes for decades before entering politics. The Rhode Island Democrat wasn't just another senator asking questions. He was a former attorney general who had personally worked with Kennedy on climate litigation, who had celebrated Kennedy's courtroom victories, who had considered him a trusted ally in the fight against corporate polluters. That personal history made what was about to happen even more devastating. Behind Whitehouse sat representatives from every major environmental organization Kennedy had worked with over 4 decades: Natural Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, Riverkeeper Alliance, Waterkeeper organizations from 37 states. They weren't there to support Kennedy's nomination. They were there to oppose it, and their presence sent a message that veteran political observers immediately recognized as terminal for his confirmation prospects. The hearing's first 2 hours had focused on Kennedy's health policy positions, his vaccine skepticism, his views on pharmaceutical regulation. Republican senators praised his willingness to challenge institutional consensus. Democratic senators expressed concern about his scientific credibility. Standard confirmation theater that could have continued for weeks without changing many minds. But then Senator Whitehouse's questioning period arrived, and the entire dynamic shifted. "Mr. Kennedy," Whitehouse began, his voice carrying none of the warmth their previous partnership might have suggested, "I want to discuss your environmental record, which has been quite distinguished over 4 decades. Kennedy's shoulders relaxed slightly at what seemed like friendly territory. "Senator, I'm proud of my environmental work. It's been the defining commitment of my professional life, protecting communities from corporate polluters who put profits over people's health." "That's an admirable record," Whitehouse acknowledged. "You've won 47 lawsuits against major polluters. You've recovered over $23 million in damages for affected communities. You've forced cleanup of some of the most contaminated waterways in America." Kennedy nodded, his activist identity fully engaged. "Those victories represent thousands of families who were being poisoned by corporations that captured the regulatory agencies meant to protect public health. It's exactly the kind of corporate accountability I want to bring to HHS." Whitehouse paused, letting Kennedy's words hang in the air before delivering the first cut. "That commitment to environmental protection, did it extend to climate change?" Kennedy's expression flickered with the first hint of caution. "Of course, Senator. Climate change is the most serious environmental crisis we face. I've been vocal about this issue for decades." "You have indeed," Whitehouse agreed, pulling out a thick folder. "In fact, I have here a speech you gave in 2018 to the Climate Reality Project. Would you like me to read what you said about politicians who enable climate denialism?" The specificity of the question created immediate tension. Kennedy responded carefully. "Senator, I've given hundreds of speeches on environmental topics over the years. I'd need to see the specific language you're referencing." Whitehouse held up the document, ensuring cameras captured its official transcript markings. "You said, and I quote, politicians who trade environmental protection for political expediency are committing a crime against future generations. There can be no compromise on climate science. You either accept the scientific consensus or you're complicit in planetary destruction." The words were passionate, unequivocal, exactly the kind of moral clarity that had made Kennedy a hero to environmental activists. Kennedy nodded slowly, recognizing his own rhetoric. "I stand by that statement, Senator. Climate change requires urgent action based on scientific consensus. Then how do you explain your support for President Trump's nomination of you to lead HHS? Whitehouse asked, his voice sharpening, when Trump has called climate change a hoax, withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement, and appointed climate deniers to every major environmental position in his administration? Kennedy had clearly prepared for this question, his response immediate. Senator, I can be more effective advancing environmental health from within the administration than criticizing from outside. My role at HHS will focus on reducing toxic exposures and chronic disease, which are fundamentally environmental health issues. From within the administration, Whitehouse repeated slowly, as if testing the words for structural integrity. Mr. Kennedy, when exactly did you decide that working for a climate-denying administration was acceptable after 40 years of calling climate denialism criminal? The question hung like an accusation. Kennedy's hands, which had been resting casually on the witness table, now gripped the edge with increased tension. Senator, political reality requires pragmatism. I can accomplish more for public health by accepting this position than by maintaining ideological purity. Whitehouse smiled thinly, the expression of someone who had anticipated exactly that answer and prepared accordingly. Pragmatism. That's an interesting characterization. Let me share some communications that provide additional context for your pragmatism. At exactly 10:37, Senator Whitehouse opened a folder marked with telecommunications subpoena seals and began reading from documents that would destroy what remained of Kennedy's environmental credibility. These are text messages between you and Trump transition team advisor Stephen Miller, dated November 18, 2024. Just 3 weeks after the election, Kennedy's face went pale. Private communications with transition officials were supposed to remain confidential. The fact that Whitehouse had obtained them through legal channels meant someone had provided them willingly, likely someone who considered Kennedy's actions a betrayal worth exposing. The first messages from you to Miller, Whitehouse read, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent chamber. Quote, I understand the president-elect has concerns about my climate advocacy. I want to assure you that I can be flexible on climate policy if the HHS position is guaranteed. The words hit the chamber like a physical blow. Flexible on climate policy. After decades of speeches about how there could be no compromise on climate science, Kennedy had offered flexibility in exchange for a cabinet position. Senator, Kennedy attempted, those messages are taken out of context. I was simply indicating openness to dialogue. Context, Whitehouse interrupted. Let me provide more context. Miller's response, same day, quote, the president needs assurance you won't publicly challenge his energy policies or climate positions. This is non-negotiable for the nomination. Your response, 3 minutes later, quote, understood. My focus will be entirely on HHS mission. Climate policy is not my lane in this role. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. Environmental activists in the gallery looked genuinely stunned. Kennedy had just been exposed negotiating away his climate advocacy as a condition of receiving political power. But Whitehouse wasn't finished. The most revealing exchange came 2 days later, he continued, when you texted Miller expressing concern about environmental groups opposing your nomination. Miller responded, quote, you need to choose between your environmental friends and this position. You can't have both. Your response, Mr. Kennedy, your exact words were, quote, I choose the position. Climate change will still be there after I've reformed healthcare from the inside. The cynicism of the statement was breathtaking. Climate change will still be there. As if planetary crisis were merely a project to return to later, after personal ambition had been satisfied. Kennedy tried desperately to explain. Senator, those were private communications reflecting complex negotiations. My commitment to environmental protection hasn't changed. Your commitment hasn't changed, Whitehouse said with barely contained contempt. Then perhaps you can explain why you withdrew from 3 major climate lawsuits within 6 weeks of those text messages. Kennedy's expression shifted to genuine shock. Whitehouse had evidence of specific legal actions, not just private communications. On December 4, you withdrew as counsel from the lawsuit against ExxonMobil for climate deception. December 15, you withdrew from the case against Koch Industries for methane emissions violations. January 8, you dropped your involvement in the landmark climate liability case against major oil companies. Kennedy attempted to respond, but Whitehouse continued relentlessly. These weren't just any cases, Mr. Kennedy. These were lawsuits you had personally initiated. Cases you had described as the most important environmental litigation of your career. You abandoned them the moment your political ambitions required it. At 10:41, exactly 38 seconds after Whitehouse had begun reading Kennedy's text messages about being flexible on climate policy, the environmental movement's most painful moment arrived. The senator invited Kennedy's former allies to address him directly. The first witness was John Adams, former president of the Natural Resources Defense Council, an organization Kennedy had worked with for 35 years. "Mr. Kennedy," Adams began, his voice heavy with disappointment, "I've known you since you were a young lawyer fighting your first river pollution case in 1983. I watched you win victories that seemed impossible. I celebrated with you when we saved the Hudson River, when we stopped mountaintop removal mining, when we forced cleanup of Superfund sites that had poisoned communities for decades." He paused, composing himself. "That's why it breaks my heart to say this. Your willingness to abandon climate advocacy for personal political power represents the greatest betrayal I've witnessed in 40 years of environmental work." Kennedy sat frozen, unable to meet Adams's eyes. The personal nature of the condemnation, coming from a mentor and former ally, was devastating in ways that political opposition could never achieve. "We raised $23 million together," Adams continued. "Money donated by people who believed in environmental protection, who trusted your commitment was genuine. You told those donors that climate change was an existential threat requiring unwavering opposition to politicians who enabled fossil fuel interests. Now you've joined an administration led by the nation's most prominent climate denier, and you did it by promising to be, in your words, flexible on climate policy." The evidence was damning not because it showed corruption in the traditional sense, but because it showed something potentially worse: the abandonment of principle for ambition. Kennedy hadn't been bribed or coerced. He had simply been offered power and decided his environmental values were negotiable. The second witness was Robert Boyle, Kennedy's former colleague at Riverkeeper, where Kennedy had spent 17 years as chief prosecuting attorney. "Bobby," Boyle said, using the personal nickname with obvious pain, "you taught me that environmental law was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. You said that corporate polluters counted on activists getting tired or getting bought off, and that our job was to be the ones who never quit, never compromised, never sold out." He held up a document. "This is the Hudson River PCB case, our landmark victory against General Electric. You told the community that we would fight until every pound of poison was removed, that no political pressure would make us settle for less than complete cleanup. Those families believed you because you had never given them reason to doubt your word." Boyle's voice broke slightly. "How am I supposed to tell them now that you traded climate advocacy for a cabinet position? What does that say about all the promises we made to communities that trusted us?" Kennedy finally spoke, his voice strained. "Robert, my environmental commitment hasn't changed. I simply believe I can be more effective from within the government." "You can't be effective on climate from within an administration that denies climate science," Boyle shot back. "You can't protect environmental health while supporting policies that accelerate environmental destruction. You've made a choice, Bobby. You've chosen personal power over principle." The silence that followed was profound. Kennedy had no answer that wouldn't either admit to abandoning his values or lie about the Trump administration's environmental record. Senator Whitehouse returned to his questioning, producing another document. "Mr. Kennedy, I have here an email you sent to a major environmental donor on January 23 of this year. The donor had asked how you could justify joining Trump's cabinet given his environmental record. Your response is quite revealing." He began reading, his voice heavy with prosecutorial precision. Quote, "I understand your concerns about the administration's climate positions. However, I believe that reforming our healthcare system to address chronic disease is the most important contribution I can make right now. Environmental advocacy will continue with or without me, but the opportunity to transform HHS comes once in a lifetime. I have to prioritize where I can have the greatest impact." Kennedy's own words condemned him. He had explicitly acknowledged that he was prioritizing personal career opportunity over environmental advocacy. "The greatest impact," Whitehouse repeated. "Mr. Kennedy, you've spent 40 years arguing that climate change is the greatest threat to human health. You've written extensively about how environmental destruction causes the chronic diseases you now claim to want to address. How exactly does joining a climate-denying administration represent the greatest impact you can have?" Kennedy had no coherent response. The logical contradiction was too obvious. You couldn't claim that environmental health was your priority while supporting policies that worsened environmental conditions. Whitehouse pressed forward. "Let me read from your own book, Crimes Against Nature, published in 2004. Kennedy visibly recoiled. His own previous writings were being used as evidence against his current positions. "You wrote, and I quote, 'The world has changed in ways that make it impossible for any person of conscience to remain silent. Corporate polluters and the politicians who serve them are committing crimes against nature and crimes against our children. There can be no neutrality in this struggle. You are either fighting for environmental protection or you are complicit in environmental destruction." Whitehouse looked up from the book. "Those words don't leave much room for flexibility or pragmatism, do they, Mr. Kennedy? The hearing concluded at 11:53 with Kennedy's environmental legacy in ruins. Former allies had publicly condemned him. His own writings had been used to expose his hypocrisy. His private communications had revealed the calculated nature of his abandonment of climate advocacy. Within hours, every major environmental organization issued statements opposing his nomination. The Sierra Club's statement was particularly pointed, noting that Kennedy had proven that even the most celebrated environmental champions have a price, and his was a cabinet position. By evening, multiple Republican senators expressed concern about Kennedy's credibility. Senator Lisa Murkowski noted that someone willing to abandon 40 years of environmental commitment for political advancement might abandon healthcare principles just as easily. The nomination survived, but Kennedy's reputation among environmentalists was permanently destroyed. The aftermath revealed patterns that extended beyond one failed environmental champion. Investigative reporting uncovered that Kennedy had quietly resigned from boards of environmental organizations in the months before his nomination, actions that had seemed routine at the time but now appeared as calculated distancing from commitments that might interfere with his political ambitions. His resignation letter from Waterkeeper Alliance, obtained by the New York Times, included language about pursuing new opportunities to advance environmental health, phrasing that now seemed deliberately vague about his actual intentions. Perhaps most damaging was the revelation that Kennedy had been discussing the HHS position with Trump advisors as early as June 2024. 5 months before the election. During those same months, he had given speeches at environmental conferences warning about the dangers of political compromise on climate change, never disclosing that he was actively negotiating to join an administration built on climate denialism. Sometimes the most effective accountability comes from people who once believed in you, holding up the mirror of your own previous words and asking what happened to that person. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse had done exactly that, using Kennedy's own environmental advocacy against his political ambitions with devastating precision. Can anyone maintain moral authority after explicitly trading values for power? Should movements trust champions who prove their principles are negotiable? Does pragmatism justify abandoning the causes you claimed were existential? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. learned these questions have answers that don't depend on political calculations or career opportunities. The text messages saying he could be flexible on climate policy told a story that 40 years of environmental speeches couldn't erase. The email saying climate change would still be there after he reformed healthcare revealed what he truly valued when forced to choose. If this exposure revealed uncomfortable truths about political ambition and environmental commitment, consider how many other celebrated advocates might operate under similar calculations. Understanding what people are willing to trade for power helps evaluate whether their advocacy was ever genuinely principled or merely strategically useful. That principle applies whether the subject is climate change, healthcare, corporate accountability, or any other area where stated values can conflict with personal advancement. Follow the negotiations, not just the speeches. Kennedy had said there can be no compromise on climate science, never imagining his own text messages offering climate flexibility would be used with such devastating effectiveness to reveal that everything, even 40 years of environmental conviction, apparently had a price when political power was offered in exchange.